afternoon and welcome. Thank you very much to the Basque Government for inviting me here to speak with you this afternoon. And as you can see from the title of my presentation, I intend to talk about lifelong learning and a focus from the United Kingdom higher education sector. I should state that I do not represent the UK higher education sector. No one does. But I'm here to give you a personal reflection on what is happening in higher education in relationship to lifelong learning, and where I think we have some lessons to learn and some opportunities to develop. I thought I'd firstly mention, and it will become a recurrent theme in this journey that I take you on, to talk briefly about my own organisation. I've been running the Higher Education Academy now for a year and a half, and it's an organisation designed to work specifically with those delivering higher education in the UK to ensure that students have an outstanding learning experience. You might think that that should be commonplace and natural, but of course in a university sector where autonomy is fundamentally important to individual institutions, it can by no means assumed as a given that students do receive an outstanding experience. Universities have many competing demands. They are required to generate research potential and economic benefit to a country. They are invested in by the governments of countries, and of course those priorities are fundamentally important, but so too are the number of students that are studying within the higher education systems of any one country. In terms of my organisation, we want to ensure that those students do have a great experience, that they do end up leaving the institution with the qualification they intended to acquire, and that they will become return users, in other words, lifelong learners, linked with and associated with the institution of their alma mater. Clearly, to do this, we want to ensure that teachers are making use of the latest pedagogic methods, that the learning spaces are the most contemporary that they can be, and that we're making use of modern technology, whatever that might mean. I'm sure many of you here this afternoon have a mobile phone. I would encourage you not to turn it off. During the course of my presentation, I would expect you to send and receive emails, send and receive text messages. Some of you will be engaged in Facebook, some of you with Twitter. And these are simple examples of how young modern learners interact with technology and their own learning environment. For me, that is absolutely crucial to understand. And perhaps most unfortunate about what I talk about is that I stand here in front of you today delivering in an environment which is outdated, with technology which has passed its appropriateness, by using a PowerPoint presentation and standing in front of a lecture as though I have all the answers. That is clearly not the case. It is not the way in which learners engage with learning environments, and there is much to be learned and for us to integrate with the learning experiences of young people and impressionable individuals if lifelong learning can really become a reality. Within the UK, where the higher education environment is very mature, the recent governments in the UK have taken a very global perspective to what higher education is. There are 2.5 million students studying in the UK for degree-level qualifications. But the UK has, as you see on this slide, over 13 campuses across the world, which is small by comparison with America, who have nearly 90 campuses throughout the world. Global higher education is a reality, and as a consequence of that, the potential that universities have for enabling lifelong learning is increasing all the time. In the UK, nearly 2.5 million students studying at a university. 1.9 million of those doing undergraduate qualifications, 500,000 doing postgraduate qualifications. 120,000 of those come from continental European countries. 280,000 of those come from outside the European Union. And they're supported by 180,000 academic staff teaching in universities. And then the final line shows that the UK has now invested in the development of overseas campuses and partnerships with other institutions, so that there are 400,000 students studying somewhere in the world who, when they finish, will have a UK university qualification. I'm sure there are very similar examples of what is happening here in Spain, as there are in many other countries, as the interest in higher education, the development of higher level skills, the engagement with individuals during their learning lifetime means that universities have an increasingly relevant part to play in not just degrees, but in helping people acquire qualifications at a higher level relevant to their changing working environment. This slide merely shows you where some of the main recruiting countries that the UK spends its time recruiting students from. China is the most prolific provider of foreign students into the UK, followed by India and Nigeria. And this pattern of countries, these are the top 10, this pattern of countries constantly changes. At one stage, Malaysia was the most commonly recruited country for UK universities. It's now China, but Nigeria is very quickly progressing up this league table. And it's expected by 2015, Nigeria will have over 30,000 students studying in the UK. The reason for that is that countries like Nigeria, like India, cannot meet the needs of their governments and their populations to provide higher level skill opportunities for them to get the sorts of jobs that they aspire to. So we have a global responsibility for lifelong learning, regardless of where we live, particularly if we live in a developed country. In terms of monetary contribution that international students make to the UK, it's estimated to be £5.5 billion annually. Now that's clearly not merely the fees that students bring when they come into a country, but it's also them living in the country, them working in the country, and them making a difference to the gross domestic product. And UK higher education alone represents nearly £60 billion of the gross domestic product of the UK's annual budget. That is a huge impact which higher education is having in the UK, which I'm sure is probably happening here in Spain as well. In the last few years, to understand some of the experiences of international students, my organisation has undertaken a project looking at what it was like to study in the UK if you were a foreign student. And I don't expect you to realise this, but I'm not British, I'm Australian. I've lived in the UK for 25 years, and I went to the UK as a foreign student. And back in the 80s when I did that, my expectations weren't necessarily all that high. I knew what I wanted to do, I was there for a purpose, and I was committed to the learning experience. However, what we've found with the studies we've done from international students in the last 2 years in the UK is found that when they arrive, they're often very unclear about what's expected of them. It takes them some time to fit in to the cultural change, to the climate change, and the way in which British people operate. And they have a lack of knowledge around that. There are often language barriers because people being recruited to a country don't always speak as their native tongue the language of that country. So many students coming to the UK have English as a second or sometimes a third language. The assessment processes which we use are not always common practice for them. And finally, participation as part of a team environment when you're in a learning place is not something which the British are generally known positively for. The British are very British-centric, and the introduction of foreigners is not always received with great excitement. So what am I trying to do about this? Well, in the Higher Education Academy, we work with the over 140 universities in the UK, and as many of the 180,000 academic staff I referred to before as we can, around three broad areas, which include the development of academic practice, teacher excellence, and trying to get institutions to change their strategies and the way in which they work with those who are students, who are employers, and who have a vested interest in what universities can provide. Rest assured, that's far from an easy task. As I mentioned earlier, the autonomy of British universities is very strongly respected and very zealously held onto. And so encouraging universities to do things differently, to perhaps focus more on the student experience than perhaps on research outputs, as an example, is not always well respected. And in addition to that, surprisingly enough, professional qualifications to teach in UK universities are not a requirement of employment. I continue to be astonished by this, in that if I feel ill and I go to visit my doctor, I want to know that that doctor is up to date with the latest medical knowledge, that they have been made aware of new drugs that could positively support my ailments. And they must do frameworks of accreditation on an annual basis. When I fly back to the UK tomorrow, I will want to be assured that the pilot of my plane is a qualified pilot, has been constantly updating their professional knowledge so that they are aware of changes to air traffic control requirements, that they are familiar with the software alterations that have been made to their aeroplane, so that my comfort, safety, and livelihood is secured between my travel from San Sebastian back to London. So why is it that in many higher education environments, we don't feel that teachers need to be professionally qualified, or that they need to update their pedagogic knowledge on an annual basis?